Hey, this is Keith Weinhold from the Get Rich Education Podcast. You are listening to my friend John Larson in the Real Estate Cowboys. Don't quit your daydream.
Hey everybody, it's Robert Helms, host of the Real Estate Guys radio show, and you are listening to the Real Estate Cowboys.
Have you thought about becoming financially free through real estate investing, but don't have the time or knowledge to get started? Welcome to the Real Estate Cowboys podcast. Each week, we discuss passive income investment opportunities in the red-hot Texas market. John Larson and the Real Estate Cowboys will show you how to leverage their team to build wealth in real estate through passive investment opportunities. And now, here's John.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of the Real Estate Cowboys. This is your host, John Larson. This week, we are going to be discussing how to deal with 3 common tenant issues. And so, here at the Real Estate Cowboys, our first advice to landlords is always to use a property manager. When you have a property manager in place for your rentals, you never really need to deal directly with your tenants at all. And trust me, I've had a lot of nightmarish situations when I try to manage properties myself. It's really it can become super cumbersome and really affect your day-to-day life. So myself, it's really tough to find a good property manager, but if you find one, hold on to them like gold. Like I have a great commercial property manager right now that I acquired a couple months ago here in the Dallas area, and she's been wonderful to work with on top of everything, just really, really knows her stuff and only charges me 3%. So I feel like I'm getting a huge value there. But, even if the situation ends up in court for an eviction, your property manager can appear as your proxy to represent your interests. But, some landlords choose not to have a property manager. In that case, you'll need to deal with every situation personally, including when there are tenant issues, right? So I wanted to give some helpful hints or helpful ways to deal with a variety of situations if you choose not to hire a property manager. And so number one thing I have on here, your tenant isn't paying the rent on time. So every now and then a tenant might pay their rent late. It shouldn't happen, but of course, as we know, it does. Here in Texas, the eviction laws really favor the landlord. You only have to give your tenant 3 days notice before you can serve them with a notice to vacate. You don't even have to give the tenant an option to come up with the back rent if you don't want. If they aren't out in 3 days, you can move on to the eviction phase. So that is one good thing about Texas with rentals. Now, this is very good if the tenant has been problematic and you just want them out. But sometimes you have what you thought was a good tenant, right? And then all of a sudden they aren't paying rent on time. What should you do? Well, I would recommend starting with a phone call, talk to the tenant, find out what's going on. Were they injured and can't work? Did they get fired? Is the situation temporary? And then from there, you can kind of make a decision whether you want to give them some leniency to catch up on rent payments. If they got fired and can no longer afford to pay rent, your best bet is probably to give them more generous move-out schedules, such as 15 days, so they can find more affordable living or a more affordable living arrangement. What you shouldn't do is take a wait-and-see approach. You either need to move on to eviction or come up with a definitive time frame for the situation to get resolved. Okay, so the longer you wait, sometimes, it might just turn into a situation where the tenant's telling you what you want to hear, and then you end up having to evict them anyway. So be careful with that. Kind of trust your gut on that one. Do not become one of the landlords who's carrying the mortgage indefinitely until the tenant finds a new job. Remember, you are a landlord to bring in money, not make interest-free loans. Okay. Number 2 would be your tenant was injured on the property. And, many investors like to purchase investment properties in the form of an LLC. That way, if a tenant were to get injured and want to sue the landlord, they can only really come after whatever asset is within that LLC, not your own personal assets, right? So that's why I do that way. That's why many other investors also form an LLC and purchase that property in an LLC. And many investors do it, for each home, which I kind of recommend as well, because you should just look at each home as its own small business. Tenant injuries aren't really that common when a landlord is responsible and maintains the property. However, tenant injuries do occur. And when that happens, an inexperienced landlord may panic and worry about losing personal assets in a lawsuit, right? But as long as you've been responsible and kept up with the maintenance issues on the property, you have very little to worry about. Obviously, you should have property and liability insurance on any rental property that you own too. Your liability insurance will kick in and cover any expenses that the tenant claims, so you don't need to worry about losing any personal assets from that. The caveat here is if you don't keep up with the maintenance, was there a loose front step that the tenant told you about and you didn't get it fixed? Were there any tenant communications about problems in the property that you ignored? If so, even if you have liability insurance, you might be facing a bigger problem. So, if tenants are reporting issues like that to you, I recommend getting those things fixed right away. A loose handrail, stuff like that where, the tenant, if that becomes faulty, the tenant can hurt themselves on their property and they brought it to your attention, you did nothing about it, they could have a serious case there. So just be careful with that. If you opt not to hire a property manager, you need to make sure that you carefully handle all tenant reports of problems on the property, okay? If a tenant injury does occur, talk to the tenant, find out exactly what happened and what injuries were incurred. No matter what the situation is, you should always get your lawyer involved as soon as possible to advise you on the best way to protect yourself here, okay? Number 3, your tenant is damaging your property, okay? Without a property manager in place, it's more challenging to keep tabs on the property, especially if this property is out of state, right? If you're an investor in California, I'm sure you're not buying a ton of rentals in California. You're probably buying rentals outside of that state. So that's another reason why it's good to have a property manager, so they're your eyes and ears on the ground in that state where you invest. Not everybody invests in their own backyard, okay? So the tenant damaging your property could be something that could just sneak by because you're not there every day or you're not there to check on the property. And so things like this could definitely occur. So careless or bad tenants could be damaging the building or its contents. However, if you make a visit to the property to collect rent or fix something that needs to be repaired, you may find that damage is being done. Okay. So yeah, that's when a tenant makes a maintenance call and you send a contractor over, your property manager over to check on it, they can kind of get a look of the environment, look at the property and see, hey, this tenant really isn't taking care of this home, and they can notify you as the landlord and be like, hey, we're going to start remedying this situation instead of letting it continue to get worse. Okay, because the last thing you want is that tenant to move out or get evicted, and now you have this huge bill, high cost turnover, and you're going to have to spend all this money to get the property rent ready again because the tenant just totally damaged it, right? That's another reason why I don't really like to do Section 8 properties. I just feel like in my experience, the tenants were just a lot more troublesome. They did a lot more damage to the property. They weren't really paying the rent there. The state was, so, they're getting some sort of government assistance. So it's just like they didn't really care as much, right? And then they don't own the home. So I've seen a lot of horror stories with, Section 8 tenants that just really damage the property. But I've seen it with market tenants too. I've just seen it more frequently with a Section 8 type of tenant. Tenants may not be reporting leaks, they may purposely be damaging things, or they may be careless and damaging appliances, walls, and other property. They may even be damaging your landscaping by not caring for it as they should. So what recourse do you have at that point? You could definitely speak to the tenant about taking better care of the property. This probably isn't going to work though. Any tenant who blatantly damages property isn't going to just change because you ask them nicely, right? So this situation is likely going to require some legal action. And as long as you have a damage clause in your lease, you can send tenants a warning notice that they need to vacate the premises in 3 days, right? So you want to make sure that lease is really tight too. Always go over your lease, whether it's your own lease or a property manager that you're working with, go over their lease. Make sure you're protected from certain things like this. And again, in Texas, laws are on your side. If the tenant refuses to vacate, you can begin eviction proceedings or even bring a sheriff to the property if that tenant ignores the court's eviction ruling. So the point is, you don't have to sit idly while a tenant damages your property, okay? But these are the 3 most common serious issues that landlords face with rentals. These are probably the 3 most common things I've ever experienced being a landlord and doing hundreds of properties, thousands really at this point. As I mentioned, a property manager in place will really help make your life a lot more peaceful as a landlord, and it will make this experience a lot more passive for you. So in the first instance, you wouldn't have to appear in court, right, to go through an eviction. In that second instance I gave you, your property manager can ensure that all needed repairs are taken care of before injuries could have a chance to occur. And in the third instance, a property manager can be your eyes and ears inside the property, helping to catch signs of carelessness to the property and damage before the tenant destroys your rental entirely, right? Because like I said, we don't want to have these huge turnover costs because that will basically just eat all the cash flow that you made while that tenant was in place. So that's not an ideal situation for a landlord. That's all the time we have this week on this particular subject. I just want to throw out some useful information on if you are a landlord who has opted not to hire a property manager. Just want to give you some advice on how to handle certain problems, and the 3 most common problems, I'd say. But that's all we have this week. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back again next week with some more great content. I hope you found this episode informative and educational. But in the meantime, always remember, what's your return on life? This is John Larson signing off. I'll see you again next week.
All opinions expressed by the hosts of the show are the opinions of American Real Estate Investments, LLC, and do not reflect the opinions of guests or sponsors. No personal or professional advice heard on this program should be considered an endorsement to follow a real estate financing or investment strategy. Before acting on any information, seek advice from your financial, tax, mortgage, or real estate advisor, as the information is not guaranteed and investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss.